What chance is there during times of darkness, amidst fear and corruption of a society, to rise above the chaos of religious persecution, civil unrest, injustice and oppression, and create a community of faith, of spiritual hope, and a revolutionary way to access God? A movement so powerful that it survives today, even when its 17th century founders are long gone. For this is the story of George Fox and how his inner hostility to reject the traditional religious teachings in a dangerous and turbulent world would lead him to become one of the founders of the Quakerism movement. Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel, The Wanderless Way. Today's video we're going to be covering the Quakerism movement and its beginnings here in the English countryside. We'll look most importantly into a man who, despite being persecuted, disapproved, arrested and jailed, continued to seek the truth and fight back against the corruption he felt was leading the people of the 17th century. So please sit back, relax and enjoy the video. If you do enjoy it, please hit that like button so we know it's been good, and subscribe to the channel to come on more adventures. To understand this story better, we must first look at the state of England during the 17th century. At the time of Fox's birth in 1624, the notorious James I was on the throne. Known most famously in history for popery, Puritans and witches, he was an unpopular king and attempts on his life were inevitably made, including the one all British people are reminded of each November, the notorious gunpowder plot of 1605. James's obsession with religion and fearfulness of the devil led him to write a tract on demonology, which was later indicated as one of the leading causes for the surge in witch trials throughout the country. For more on the witch trials, do subscribe to the channel as there's more on that coming soon. It's fair to say that it was a pretty dark period and a fearful one for those who didn't practice or agree with whichever religion was in royal favour at the time. George Fox was born unto this world just at the end of James I's reign. The oldest of 4 children, his good and honest parents were Christopher Fox and his wife Mary, and they lived in Fenny Drayton in Leicestershire. Christopher Fox was a weaver by trade, but also a local churchwarden, and he brought his family up in a humble, middle-class environment with Puritan values. It was reported that even from a child, George was unusually sensitive to God, having been well taught by his godly parents, and he remembered experiencing the pureness of divine presence at the age of just 11. He later recalled that he had been an exceptionally serious boy of much gravity and staidness of mind and spirit. During George's infancy, the king at this point dies, and so begins the reign of his son, Charles I. Despite any hopes for improvement by the succession of a new king, history reminds us that things aren't going to get much better for the general life of ordinary people. For the dark ruling years of Charles I, we now know were to lead to further religious unrest, civil war, and eventually the execution of the king himself. This information about the state of the country during these years is therefore the backdrop of our story and can perhaps help us to better understand the environment that George and his fellow man were accustomed to. As George grows up, he becomes a cobbler's apprentice and earns an honest living. But as his teenage years ripen, he becomes tormented by religion and he starts to become dubious about the Church of England. He becomes obsessed by the pursuit of a simplicity of life, meaning humility and abandonment of luxury. By around the age of 19, George, who was associated with men who were professors and followers of the standard religion, began to look down on their behaviour and, to be specific, their consumption of alcohol. Following on from one particular drinking session in which George resorted to leave, he goes on to hear an inner voice during a prayer session. The voice was to say, "Thou seest how young people go together into vanity, and old people into the earth. Thou must forsake all, young and old, keep out of all, and be a stranger unto all." Driven by this inner voice, in September 1643, he decides to go on a quest of discovery. During this time, there were a number of other people seeking reform in the Church of England, and scattered in the villages, towns and hamlets in certain areas, small groups of people had begun to seek a new way by creating their own competing churches. Some of these seekers had begun to emerge in the 1620s. They considered all organised churches corrupt and were waiting for God's revelation. Spread around the country, they were often informal, and their beliefs embraced a broad spectrum of ideas depending on the localisation. For our part of the story, we'll be meeting those seekers in the small town of Sedbergh, Cumbria, which continues today as a place of pilgrimage. Stay to the end to find out more. George, on his mission, moves first towards London. By this point, the English Civil War had begun to develop, and I think it could be fair to say that it was quite a dangerous time to be travelling the country, especially on a quest to object the chosen religion. Regardless of the danger, George sought out the company of clergy in order to find some comfort and understanding. He was studying the Bible obsessively, but no matter who he troubled his concerns with, he could find no peace or counsel from the beliefs of these educated people. At some point, he claims to hear another voice that tells him that he can find everything he is looking for from within, that whatever he is seeking outside of himself is available within. Fox based his ethics on leading a life without sin, and he found that through prayer and meditation, people could develop a greater understanding of the nature of the faith, a process which he called opening. This notion that all people are capable of directly experiencing the divine nature of the universe, and that rituals can be ignored as long as one experiences a true spiritual conversion, becomes one of his fundamental beliefs. This meant that absolutely anyone was capable of preaching a personal sermon. It was not restricted to the educated or the noble men of the church alone. Fox preached that the qualification for ministry was given by the Holy Spirit, and that believers were also not confined to a church building for worship. For God's presence could be felt everywhere, and people should be free to worship in fields and orchards should they wish. Now clear on his message, in 1647, George begins to preach publicly. These personal sermons began to create small groups of people who would travel together, and these were affectionately known as friends. At the time, this was a radical contrast to the Church of England. The belief that people can follow their own inner guide rather than relying on a strict reading of Scripture and without need of the word of educated clerics was preposterous to some. Fox and his friends no doubt came upon a tremendous amount of hostility, and in some areas they travelled were met with harsh receptions, and reports of being whipped and beaten when travelling through certain areas are in abundance. When looking at this with a critical eye, it was not just the notion that these people were risking the souls of the people they preached to, but it was also a topic of monetary loss. A custom dating back to the Old Testament times, which became adopted by the Christian Church, was the paying of tithes. These tithes, or church taxes as we'd probably call them today, required that lay people were to contribute a tenth of their income for religious purposes. Fox rejected the very idea of church tithes. He felt they were corrupt, and he encouraged his followers to also reject them. He didn't believe that elaborate religious ceremonies and expensive church buildings were necessary. Regularly complaining about immoral decisions in society, and his campaign for the refusal to pay church tithes was something that caused him quite a bit of bother. On his journey, he was imprisoned several times, the first being in Nottingham in 1649. More arrests were to follow, generally for causing a disturbance and travelling without a pass. In 1650, he was imprisoned for blasphemy in Derby, and the judge mocked his "tremble at the word of the Lord," calling him, and whoever were to follow him, a Quaker, a notion that ironically sticks. After refusing to fight against the return of the monarchy because another of his beliefs was a refusal to take up arms, his sentence was doubled. During his many prison sentences, George continues to write and preach from his cell, always believing that it matters not where the body is because the voice of the spirit can be found within. During one imprisonment, and later on in our story, he is accused of conspiracy against Charles II. He writes to the king to offer him spiritual advice. Fox states that Charles should refrain from war and domestic religious persecution, discourage oath-taking, plays and maypole games. It was a bold move, but eventually one that played in his favour, for the king, although not taking his advice, decided to release him after realising he demonstrated no military ambitions. Although George had no desire to found a sect, by the year 1652 we can see the Quaker movement really starting to take shape, and we approach the peak of our story. 40 years after the area had been horrifically troubled by the witch trials, George Fox makes a decision to climb the mysterious and formidable hill that looms over Pendle in Lancashire. His autobiography states, "As we travelled, we came near a very great hill called Pendle Hill, and I was moved of the Lord to go up to the top of it, which I did with difficulty. It was so very steep and high. When I was come to the top, I saw the sea bordering upon Lancashire. From the top of this hill, the Lord let me see in what places he had a great people to be gathered." And so he travelled into Wensleydale, through Dent, Grisdale and Garsdale, preaching all the time he went, until at last he arrives in Sedbergh, where he'd heard a group of seekers were meeting. At this point, I'll just mention, if you haven't seen it already, over on my main channel I've done a full video on Sedbergh, which is a bit of a tourist hotspot in Cumbria, so feel free to check that out later if you want. #shameless plug. So back to George. Once he gets to Sedbergh, he looks up one of these seekers, known as Richard Robinson, who resides at the farm in Brigg Flats. Richard listens to him and agrees to take him to a meeting that is taking place at one of the homes of another seeker couple. During the next few days, George Fox spoke to and convinced many in Sedbergh, and it is here from a bench beneath a yew tree in the churchyard that he addresses a large crowd. One of his hearers was Francis Howgill, a separatist preacher who said, "This man speaks with authority." A meeting of the seekers was to be held the following Sunday in the chapel on Firbank Fell, and Francis was to be among the preachers. George Fox was invited to attend, which he did, but he did not go into the chapel and instead chose to sit outside on a rock. In the afternoon, people gathered about him, and in many reports suggest that there were over 1,000 folk in the crowd who carefully listened as he declared God's everlasting truth. For those that thought it strange to see a man preach on a hill and not in their church, he said, "I was made to open to the people that the steeple house and that ground on which it stood were no more holy than that mountain." Many were convinced that day and travelled with others of the Valiant 60 throughout the country and later to America, the West Indies, Turkey, Russia, Holland, Germany and many other distant places. This meeting on Firbank Fell, which is still known in Sedbergh as Fox's Pulpit, is generally regarded as the beginning of the Quaker movement and the Religious Society of Friends, and is a place of pilgrimage for many friends from Britain and overseas. Today, the meeting house at Brigg Flats has become a place of great interest, attracting friends and non-friends from all areas and countries. It is the oldest meeting house in the north and the third oldest in England. When George Fox died in 1691, there were over 50,000 Quakers. Today, the movement continues. Thank you for watching. Do drop me some comments if you have any stories about the Quaker movement. And if you've enjoyed the video, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel to see where we're heading next. Have a great day, everyone. See you next time. Keep wanderlusting.